So welcome everybody to Delaware Association of Independent Schools first webinar series. We've joined forces this year to offer programs that I think we'd love to do at our own schools, but we can get a greater audience and a phenomenal panel as you will find out quickly when they introduce themselves, of experts in the field. And so we're happy to have students and parents from several different schools in the Northern Delaware area. Just a little bit of webinar format. We're going to have our panelists introduce themselves in just a moment, but we do have the Q&A open for all of our audience members. So if anybody has questions, they can certainly ask it in the Q&A. And then also in the Q&A, we have the upvote capabilities as well. So if someone asks a question that you would really like the answer to, please click the thumbs up button to upvote that question. And Mrs. Rigner from the Archmere College Counseling Office will make us aware that there are good questions in the queue that we want to get to. We have pre-planned questions for our panelists, but we want to make sure that the audience today, everyone gets their questions answered because that's the whole point of the program tonight. Although I am also excited to be a facilitator because I'm going to learn a whole lot from our panelists tonight. And that's so when you want to learn something, you just pitch a webinar and invite a whole bunch of friends to join you, and then you can become better educated on something and help your students out. I think that's our strategy. That's Mrs. Rigner and my strategy at Archmere, at least. Okay, so I'm going to turn things over to our panelists to introduce themselves, to set context, and it'll also help us direct questions. So Holly, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you, Chris. Thanks for the intro. I'm going to share my screen here. And let's just do that. Can everyone see that? Can you all?
Yep, you're good, Holly.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to talk about the gap year option. I'm Holly Bull. I've been pretty steeped in the gap year field most of my life. I've been a gap year student, took a gap year before college. I took a gap year after my sophomore year in college. I've done 2 full gap years myself. And I've been a gap year counselor for over 30 years now. All I do is gap year counseling, and I work with over 3,000 students, just like midwifing them through the process. I'm president of the Center for Interim Programs. We're the oldest independent gap year counseling organization in the United States, here in Princeton, New Jersey, and have worked with over 8,000 students at this point since we started in 1980. And my father started this company after being a teacher and a headmaster of private schools in the US and abroad, and always saw a need for something like this. So he was a real pioneer in the field. And I was lucky enough to have an in-house counselor for my own gap year plans. So what I'd like to cover is just, quick hit of why students take gap time and benefits. And I think this is sort of the core, is just trying to find out more about themselves. Like, who am I? What am I doing on this planet? What am I interested in? And having some time to go and explore in this way without the schooling process. And the sense of agency that's really important, taking the reins and owning what you're up to. Many students, and certainly after this last year, I have an 18-year-old senior myself, she's fried. Just resting, offloading stress. I don't think a summer is often enough time for people to really rejuvenate fully before stepping into 4 more years or more of schooling. So this is a real benefit. And a lot of students say, I'm just burned out. I just need a break. And for me, this is a big one. What's the relevance of all the stuff we're cramming into our head, all these years in school, to the world around us? And if you can get that connection between high school and college, you're taking all that excitement about learning again and that sense of relevance into the college process, which is why students often are better students. They're more fired up. Many students just want to garner skills, you're not getting in a classroom, and this sort of resume building, you're front loading skills before you even hit college at 18 or 19 or 17, 18, 19. And these are often skills that are more useful for you in the work world beyond college than many classes. And it's kind of a missing piece, I think, for some of these high school students. And then many students are looking for, what am I studying? What do I want to major in? How do I know what I want to get at? Or if I think I want to get at this, is it really what I want to do? My gap year in part was spent in Hawaii doing aquaculture research, thinking, maybe I want to be a marine biologist. And it took a month or so before I thought, no, I don't, helpful to know before majoring in that in college. So finding out what you do or don't want to do is going to be helpful. And then just how you transition into the work world beyond college with these skills, and having had a year to just practice choosing and creating your life, that's personal power. You need time to do that. And that's what these students are taking into interviews with jobs down the line. Over and over, I hear students saying, I got my job partly through my gap experiences, what I brought to the table. So lots of benefits here for students. And now I will pass the baton over to, is it Helen next? No, sorry, Bob. So let me stop my share and look forward to answering questions later on here. Oops.
Holly, thank you very much. My name is Bob Clegget. I am now actually mostly retired, but I am working part-time kind of pro bono at Colorado College as the coordinator of a fairly new organization, which is called the Gap Year Research Consortium at Colorado College. And I'll share with you some of the research that I and the consortium has done later. But over the 45 years actually that I worked in college admissions and financial aid, and also as a college counselor, having been at both ends of the process. Anecdotally, I can tell you I have never met a student who took a gap year and regretted it afterwards. And the positive effects about which I want to speak are many, and I'll do that later. But I just want to try to disabuse you, I guess, of any sense that there are downsides that should be holding you back from at least considering a gap year, because there are just so many upsides. And the Gap Year Research Consortium at Colorado College is looking in detail at what those are, and I'll speak more about that later. But it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to Chris and Catherine for inviting us.
JT?
Hi, everyone. My name is JT Duck. I am the Dean of Admissions at Tufts University. I have worked in admissions at Swarthmore, at Haverford, at Brandeis, MIT, and I used to be a college counselor. So I've seen a few things in my career. And I can tell you that in all the places that I have worked, the folks in my offices have been very supportive of gap years. And so from the admissions side of things, we get excited about students that want to do a gap year. I think it shows a lot about a student's curiosity, about their motivation, about their maturity, about their independence. And so we do get excited about that. So while I have your attention, I will just clear up one or two misconceptions about the admissions process and gap years. And I think one of the big misperceptions is that sometimes students feel like they need to know exactly what they want to do on a gap year by the beginning of their senior year before they ever apply to colleges. They have to have it all figured out as part of their plan, right? Many colleges, I will say, allow students to request a gap year during April or May or even June at the end of their senior year. And so for many of the students at the schools that I've worked at, including Tufts, they haven't figured it out. They figured it out second semester of senior year. That they want to take a gap year, they're developing a plan, there's something they want to do, and then they submit that plan or that proposal to us in the admissions process. And so we give them space to do that. Every college does this a little bit differently, but you do not have to have it all figured out ahead of time. There are some students who do. And so they go into their senior year knowing they want to take a gap year. Sometimes they'll know what they want to do, or sometimes they'll spend the year figuring that out. And sometimes they'll tell us about it in the application process. So we can talk about that a little bit later on this evening, but you do not have to have it all figured out if you don't have it figured out just yet. So with that, I want to turn it over back to Chris.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Helen Laster, and I just finished my sophomore year at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. I am a student who recently took a gap year 2 years ago. And so that's why I'm here to share about my recent experience, pre-COVID, of course. I think that Holly mentioned a lot of really great benefits of gap years, and they're all things that I felt as a benefit to myself. But one unexpected benefit that I just want to bring up too is I think I came into college with a lot more respect for and like thankfulness for the the services colleges offer too. So like things as simple as the dining hall and the washing machines, I was thrilled by, because I had just spent a whole gap year washing my clothes by hand and cooking every meal. So just even those little things, like yes, there are totally big advantages, but even the little things really seem so much. You have so much more respect for them after taking a gap year. All right, yeah, Chris, you can go.
Thanks, Helen. And we're going to hear from all of our panelists. Like I said, we have several pre-planned questions, and we're going to distribute them out throughout, because I think everyone, as we shared kind of when we chatted before the webinar started, everyone has a different perspective here. I think it's important to hear from all of you. Our first question does go to Holly and Bob, and ladies first. Okay, Holly, what is your definition of gap year? And what are some of the misconceptions of the term? Are there non-traditional gap years?
Yes, great. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I mean, my definition of a gap year is time that you take, but it's intentional time. So you're not just taking off. You take some time to go and explore interests with intentionality, and that's it, pretty much. And it can be different lengths of time. I think the term gap year is a bit misleading. Sometimes people think I have to take a gap year. No, it should be called gap time. We also work with all ages, so sometimes older adults are taking short stints of time. But again, with that kind of very conscious focus on, let me go explore this area of interest, you know, in an organized fashion. I think there are, I mean, for me, there are all different kinds of gap years, or there's all different kinds of gap time. You could work for a year. You might have a whole range of things you've created on your own. You don't always have to be on a program. So I think that's also a misconception. Do I have to do these particular things to have a valid gap year? So I would say, you know, the non-traditional things would be the non-group programs, potentially, given what people are assuming these days. Bob, do you have anything to offer?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I hope you'll all do as you contemplate this possibility down the road is that you will not look at it as a year off, but a year on, where you can do something that for once, you know, in contrast with probably at least the last 4 years, well, it depends upon where you are in high school, of course, in contrast with what you are currently experiencing wherever you are in college. With trying to do so many things attuned to the impact it will have on college admissions down the road, here is an opportunity to do something that really for once has nothing to do with improving your chances of getting into some college, and to pursue things that, you know, for the pure intrinsic love of them, whatever it might be. And you know, that could be an internship, it could be learning a language or an instrument or whatever. But look at it as an opportunity to kind of step off the treadmill that you probably at some point during your high school years feel like you're on, and do something different that for once isn't related to academics. It could, of course. If it's related to academics, that's fine too, of course. But look at it as an opportunity to broaden your horizons and do something for the pure love of it. And then that will make it a year on and not a year off.
Wow, that's some great snippets. I've already written down 3 quotes from you for our tweet later on. So thank you very much. Love that insight. Helen, I'm going to jump to you because I think it's a good segue. Can you talk about what you did in your gap year and how you went about planning it?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very pro gap year household. So I kind of knew that I wanted to take a gap year right away. I knew it was something that I could do. It wasn't until probably my junior year of high school where I was like, yes, I definitely want to do this. I need to do this because, you know, I need a break. I want to, you know, figure out who I am, all those kind of reasons Holly mentioned before. And so I went about planning it by first, you know, well, what do I want to do? I want to go abroad. I don't want to stay in Delaware. I don't want to stay in the United States. I want to see something different. Um, so I basically started by picking countries I might be interested in. And I ended up finding programs that let me go to Nepal and Galapagos. And I have a friend, I had been previously worked with an organization that's based in Kenya. And so I also kind of went to the director of that organization, was like, hey, do you need help in Kenya? Can I come help you out over there? And she said yes. And so that's how that part worked out. So yeah, I split my gap year into kind of three parts. I spent part of it in Kenya, part of it in Nepal, and part of it in Galapagos. And in each of those places, I did something different. So in Kenya, I worked on beadwork and building wells. In Galapagos, I did animal conservation with the tortoises, and I taught English. And in Nepal, I did bird surveys and rhododendron surveys and looking at how those things, were changing as a result of climate change. And then I also kind of in between those took some time for fun. I am a big nerd, I admit it. So I went to New Zealand and went to all of the Lord of the Rings sites I could. So yeah, it wasn't just, but it was definitely time on where I wanted to do this. I wanted to do service in some way with animals, with people, however. And so I looked for ways that I could do that.
Helen, I feel like you did more in your gap year than I've done in my entire life. Okay, so, but that's good. That's outstanding. JT, I was actually going to go to this question to you, and a question actually came up in the Q&A as well that I think is fairly similar. Should students, and Bob actually mentioned college, right? So we had a little bit of a segue there. Should students share in the application process if they're considering or definitely doing a gap year after high school?
That is a good question, and I get that question sort of covertly quite a bit from students that are just wondering what role that might play in the admissions process. So if you are someone who is going into your college admissions process, your application process, and you are considering a gap year, what I would do is carefully research what each of the college's gap year policies are that you're considering applying to, and just looking to see how they talk about gap years, how supportive they are. I will tell you, at the places that I've worked, we're intrigued with what students are thinking about doing with their gap years. It would not have worked against any student in our admissions process for a student to tell us that they're thinking about doing a gap year. And it would have shown us a sign of like what they're curious about, how invested they are in it, and sort of the things that they're thinking about. That said, most of the students who end up doing a gap year, at least at Tufts, are students that haven't told us about it in the admissions process. Either they didn't know yet, or they chose not to disclose it, and they chose to tell us that later on. So I would say do your homework ahead of time to look at the colleges just to see if they have policies that say anything about limitations to doing gap years in the admissions process. Maybe reach out to an admissions counselor at the school and ask them if this would work against you in any way or work in your favor. But again, you don't have to have this figured out ahead of time. So you can apply and then realize later on that this is what you want to do.
Little technical difficulties there, but thank you very much, JT. Bob, I'm going to go to you. Since we're on a little bit of a college roll, why should colleges want students on their campuses that have completed gap years? And I know you have some statistics, so let me know if you'd like me to pull up your presentation and any of the slides that you have. You're muted, Bob, just like I was.
Chris, yeah, perfect. Thank you. So, this is raw results of average GPAs of students who took a gap year, and shown with the blue bars, versus student take a gap year, everybody else, with the red bars. And you can see that the ends at the top of each column start out fairly small. They got somewhat bigger by 2014. Just to explain this, I had 4 years of GPA data for the class of 2011. I had 3 years of data for 2012, 2 years for 2013, and 1 year for 2014. Now, I have to say that these raw results, these average GPAs of gap years versus non-gap year students, were not particularly surprising, because traditionally, of course, students who have taken a gap year have come from more affluent families, have attended better schools like Archmere and the other schools represented here, Tower, etc. So you would expect that they would probably perform on average somewhat better than those in the rest of the student body. Can we go to the next slide? Perfect, thank you. One other institution replicated the study that I did at Middlebury. I sent out requests to about 50 of my admissions counterparts all over the country, and I was a little disappointed that UNC was at Chapel Hill was the only one to respond. On the other hand, I could not have chosen an institution more different from Middlebury in terms of being a larger public institution. And the results were even stronger. And again, you can see the ends at the top of each of the lighter blue columns. These are the gap year students, but they had dramatically higher GPAs than the huge number of students who hadn't taken a gap year. So again, this was not surprising. Now, before we move to the next slide, let me wade into the weeds just a little bit. What we did at both institutions, and it will be the next 2 slides, is controlled statistically, just for the gap year students, controlled for the academic rating that they had received in the admissions process. And each institution, most institutions in general, I know Tufts has an academic rating system, Harvard does. I mean, most more selective institutions have some kind of academic rating system that subsumes all of the even somewhat subjectively academic criteria that are in admissions application. I mean, obviously grades, scores, rigor of program, AP testing, etc. But also things like, you know, the fire in the belly that comes through application essays. It comes through sometimes also in recommendations. So it's a holistically arrived at academic rating. Different institutions have different scales, of course, but it turns out that it is by far the best predictor for actual academic performance in college, which is why it's an important admissions factor. So knowing that it is such a good predictor, that at least at Middlebury, when I did a study of that, it predicted about 1/3 of the variability in academic performance at Middlebury. And that's a very high percentage statistically. And it remained actually a strong predictor right through senior year. In fact, in some cases, it actually increased its predictive power over the 4 years. So what we did at both Middlebury and later you'll see at UNC Chapel Hill is how gap year students, not comparing them now to non-gap year students, but how gap year students ended up doing academically compared to what we would have predicted. So Chris, if we could go to the next slide, perfect. So again, this is the 4 classes for which we had data, 4 years for 2011 and so on. This shows the amount using a 4.0 grading scale, the amount by which on average the GPAs of gap year students exceeded that which would have been predicted based solely on their academic rating. Based solely on their performance. You can see in all cases the bars are positive. You may find yourself wondering, and by the way, the bluer bars are statistically significant. The lighter blue bars are not, but they're still all positive. You can see that the positive effect lasts, at least for those where we have 2 or 3 or 4 years of data. It lasts for at least 2 years and probably beyond based on what we have here. You may be asking, a 0.1 difference in GPA, a 0.15 difference in GPA, does that really matter? Well, the reality is that institutions like Middlebury, and we'll see the same thing even more strongly at UNC Chapel Hill, that because of the clustering of grades that occur in colleges, that actually does make quite a significant difference in overall class standing. So this was very much a positive effect that I had anticipated when we determined that we could control for the academic rating, and that I hope will help parents and students as well, but realize that taking a year off does not have to have any kind of impact, any kind of negative impact, I should say, on their academic performance. The next slide shows for UNC Chapel Hill, you see it's even more dramatic and even more consistent. And in fact, for the class of 2013, the positive effect of taking a gap year actually increases. I want to emphasize, I'm not positing a cause effect here, but I think there is a correlation between taking a gap year and students performing better than we would have expected. And one more slide. This is the data from the 4 institutions of the 12 that are members of the Gap Year Research Consortium at Colorado College. 4 of those 12 institutions chose to give us their data, gap year data for 3 years of academic performance. You can see that it's less consistent here and that there are more lighter colored bars that were not statistically significant. That was mostly because of the cohort, the end, so to speak, being quite low at some of those member institutions, but still they were by and large very positive. I'm not at liberty, unfortunately, to tell you which colleges those are, because part of the membership in the research consortium is that we not share any institution's confidential data publicly. But here again, you can see the positive effect. It's a slightly different scale on the y-axis, so don't confuse the lower bar, say for College 1. That in fact would have been a much higher bar visually, at least on the earlier charts that you saw. But this is just one measure of the positive, I think, impact of taking a gap year, that students actually end up doing better than we would have expected, probably as a result of taking a gap year.
Thanks, Bob. Holly, I'm going to combine 2 questions here for you. things that people should be aware of, because I think we've shown that gap years have a lot of positives, right? So what are some things that students, their parents, even their counselors should be aware of when thinking about and planning? And then what would an ideal timeline? I think JT talked a little bit to timeline, as did Helen for her situation, but what would be a healthy timeline after I've decided, yes, this is definitely something that I want to do?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I call them to the pitfalls and challenges of gap time. The first one is do your due diligence on programs. So if you're landing in something, you don't want to land in a dud. Ideally, you want to be as safe as you can be in this world, and with something that has good structure, support, enough going on. Also, for many students, having some kind of a built-in peer group or community is really key, especially after this last year. And that can affect people more than they may realize. It doesn't mean you always have to be with a peer group, but some part of a gap year can really help to be part of a community, whether it's peers, American peers, international peers, or just people of all ages with a common interest. You also, when you're planning a gap year, if you're doing more than one thing, you don't want too many gaps during your gap year. So you want to make sure that, and it pretty much follows a school calendar. So just making sure that you've got something in the fall when people are heading off to college, you're off on your experience in the fall, break in between, and then January through May, you have other things that are planned. It doesn't mean you have to pack every moment of your gap year. You know, my gap year was work in the summer, help pay for all the airfare during my year, heading off to Hawaii in the fall, internship, marine biology, home for a break, and then heading off to another program for 3 months in Greece in the spring, an academic cultural study program. So I did 2 main things during the year, and that was marvelous, and then worked another summer. So those would be the main things I would say, just be aware of. And then in terms of when to start, typically in the fall of the senior year, students are really working on college applications, and it's nice not to derail them. I mean, I think parents can start talking to their child about the gap year option at 6 years old. I mean, to my mind, just should be an option. So just bring it up as one of the possibilities. But in terms of actually making the plans for it, you can wait until the college apps are out the door. And then January onward, that's when you start to see the gap year fairs taking place. And you have time at that point to start working on your plans. It's not like applying to college. You can step into things pretty quickly. So in terms of deadlines, application deadlines, they tend to be a little later for gap year programs.
Chris, you're muted.
Oh, see, I was unmuted and then I muted myself. Sorry. Helen, I'd like to go to you. I know you briefly touched on your kind of timeline. You were definitely someone that wanted to do a gap year, but could you talk about when you planned your certain things? And I would also love to know if everything went completely smoothly throughout gap year planning and applications, or if there were pitfalls in the road, and what type of, if there were, what type of how did you look at that? Was it a disaster or was it a growth opportunity for you?
Yeah. As I said, I grew up in my household is very pro gap year. So like Holly said, I think we started talking about it around 6. Or my parents were like, yeah, you have this opportunity if you want to take it. Junior year, I knew for sure, yes, I want to take it. Need a break. If I continue going as I'm going, I'm just going to slog my way through college and not recognize it for the opportunity it is. So I definitely want to take a gap year so I can come back rejuvenated and ready to tackle college, you know, fully and, you know, with all my energy and all my excitement. I don't think I started planning my gap year actually until about January of my senior year. I applied early decision or early action to most of my schools. So I actually knew by December whether I'd gotten in. And so then the second half of my senior year, other than finishing classes, I was planning, I was researching, I was having conversations, sending emails, for sure. During the planning process, I didn't come across a lot of pitfalls. The biggest pitfalls for me that happened is I think every single time I had to get on an airplane during my gap year, something went wrong. There was one flight where one of the water tubes on the plane broke and it started raining on us. There was a flight that got delayed 2 days. Like and you know, it's not the airplane's fault. It's not my fault. And so the biggest thing I learned was to just kind of roll with it, actually. Um, yes, I have a program to get to, but I'm in contact with them. I'm keeping up. They understand that there's nothing I can do to get there any faster. Um, and so the best thing, you know, like I spent so much of high school stressed about the next grade and wanting to get everything in on time. And, you know, if I need an extension, I could ask for one, but it's very structured. So in some ways it was liberating to go on this experience and run into these problems with transportation and stuff and be like, okay, you know, this has happened and I am dealing with it, but for now, just enjoy my time in the airport.
Yeah, and those are exactly the skills I think that people don't realize you're garnering. It's just rolling with change is a skill. It's a life skill, and you know, you figure it out. And your parents aren't there to help. Sometimes you just have to figure it out. It's really well worth it. Chris, I don't know. This might be a good time for me to show the types of programs and the plan.
Sure.
Or later, just totally up to you.
Go ahead.
Okay, let me do my screen again here. Okay, so I separate programs into, I call everything a program, and I separate them into these 4 main categories. So you have the facilitated group programs specifically set up for gap year students. So these are 3 to 9 months. They guarantee you a peer group. These were marvelous last year in the face of COVID because they ran in the US, mainland US or Hawaii, and they were able to run on site. Nobody was sitting in front of computers. And so these can be anything from cultural study to adventure travel to marine related to art history, studio art, or outdoor adventure type programs. And you are paying the most for them. It's $15,000, $17,000 a semester, typically for one of these that run fall or spring. The next category, and often people start with these in the fall for the most structure and the support at the start. The next category would be which is not popping up here, wait a minute, the skill-based intensives. And these are not coming up. These are shorter, like 1 to 4 week placements. Okay, they're not coming up. So these are with people, but you're really zeroing in on a particular skill or training. So it could be getting a wilderness EMT certification. It could be learning how to run a recording studio or cooking intensives. There's a whole range of these that sometimes students are weaving into their gap time as well. And then the next category, I'm sorry, this isn't working here, is, let me just take off screen, stop share here. The next category would be the internship placements, so more independent, where you're living with fellow interns in shared housing. I had 16 students in Cape Town, South Africa this past spring doing substantive work placements and learning how to cook for themselves, all the things that Helen was talking about. It was like, I have to do my own laundry. You know, it's like a half step into the life beyond college. And you can do this at 18 or 19. So in getting good work experience. And then all the volunteer options is a final category. So these are much more low cost, doing trail work, doing disaster relief work. It could be working on farms, ranches, on board tall ships, working with children, working with animals. And so people are looking at combinations of those as they pull these into a year. The other thing I wanted to say is that don't be surprised if your plans are changing as you go through a gap year. So you may lay out a scenario for your year at the start, but you're changing. You have no idea where your head's going to be come November. That's normal. And so you can tinker with your plans as you go. Okay, thank you.
Chris, can I just add to what Holly said in terms of the first category, the programs? It's absolutely true that for those who pay the full cost, they are reasonably expensive. They're not quite as much as a year of tuition in college, but at the same time, many of the programs offer need-based financial aid,
Yeah.
Which can make it affordable. Some of them actually to even a majority of the students who are participating. And if financial resources is an issue for you, as it probably is for just about everybody, that's worth looking into in terms of eligibility for need-based aid.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. The other thing is that you can use often 529 plan money for programs like that that are accredited, even if you can't get the credit, because often if you're deferring college, they say, fine, take your gap year, but don't garner credit. But you could use 529 plan money, and that often helps people as well.
And I just want to jump in and say that I think what I did fell into 3 of those categories. So I definitely did one of those programs that were, regimented and planned. I learned how to scuba. I spent kind of 2 weeks doing, building a skill there. And I also, did a volunteer internship in Kenya by myself. And that was kind of the 3rd category that Holly talked about.
Thanks, everybody. JT, I'm going to jump to you because Tufts has a unique internal gap option, correct? And can you talk about what students do if they select, how they select that option, how they end up in that option, and what was the motivation to create that? Because that's not something that every school offers.
That is correct. So Tufts has, there's a division within Tufts called the Tisch College of Civic Life. Tufts tends to attract students that are very interested in civic engagement, in social justice and international relations, that are thinking about their role in society and the world. And so through our Tisch College of Civic Life many years ago, we started what is called the 1+4 Bridge Program. And that 1 is the gap year, followed by 4 years at Tufts. And so we built in an internal gap year for incoming students that want to do that. And so the way it has worked historically at Tufts is that after students are admitted to the university and choose to enroll, they can then apply to do this program. And we will typically have 15, 20, maybe 25 students a year do the 1+4 program. And what it is a year-long placement in a social or civic engagement organization somewhere in the world supported by the university. And so it's a way of doing a structured program as part of your college journey before you embark on campus courses on our campus in outside of Boston. It's basically an innovative bridge year for students that are looking to do something, and it gives them the structure, it gives them the peer group with which to do it, and students would go to one of 4 different locations around the world after an orientation program on our campus outside of Boston. So in years past, we've done this in Ecuador, we've done it in Brazil, we've done it in Uruguay and in India. And it's just a way of doing a gap year through the university with other students who are also going to be joining you at Tufts. And so it's been so popular that we started a second version of this that's not quite a gap year, but it has a lot of the same elements. And we call it a Civic Semester. So in the fall of 2019, we had our first Civic Semester. We had 12 students who went to Urubamba, Peru as part of their first semester of college. And they got 4 college credits, which is what they would have gotten if they were on the Tufts campus in Medford. But it was basically a condensed version of the 1+4 gap year program, but kept them on track to graduate in 4 years. So for students who wanted to do that, they could do that. So different colleges will make this available in different ways. It's pretty uncommon to have something quite like this, but the idea is that there were so many students expressing interest in doing a gap year, and Tufts in particular tends to draw students thinking about these types of things. So we built it into our program and just made it as accessible and easy as possible for students to do that. And I will just echo the financial aid piece there. For students that are receiving financial aid at the university, that is folded into these programs as well. So we don't want finances to be an obstacle or a barrier for students doing this. We have not done the 1+4 program last fall or last year or this year, just because of the international restrictions around travel right now. But as soon as we can, we'll bring it back, probably in the fall of 22.
JT, I want to say something really quickly about Tufts, which you may not know, is, and just real kudos to Tufts, because years ago in the 80s, when my father and I were working in our Cambridge office, Tufts approached us to create a year of service and wanted help with it. And it didn't get off the ground then, but this was way before Harvard created their program. I mean, Tufts was really on the forefront with this idea in mind.
Thanks, guys. And we have anyone chime into the Q&A question that we have. JT, we've talked about this, but I'm sure some of others have opinions. The question is actually, is it advisable to consider applying to different colleges after your gap year? I certainly have an opinion on this, but I'd love to hear from our panelists. JT, could we start with you, and then maybe we could see if anybody else wants to chime in as well.
Yeah, so I will be the dour one here. So when students request a gap year from a college or university, typically it comes with the expectation that you will not enroll at another college during that year, and that you will show up on our campus a year from now. And so the expectation is that you're not applying to other colleges during the gap year if you've been approved for one by a university. Can we make you enroll a year from now? No. So occasionally students will do that, but really the expectation with the gap year is that you're holding a seat for the following fall if you've worked out that arrangement with the college.
Could I echo that just from my own perspective? And I don't want to say that taking a gap year will never have any positive impact upon your candidacy for college admissions. It could, but it shouldn't be the primary reason to take a gap year. I think some students think that this is going to be like a magic wand, and they will suddenly be admitted to some of the places to which they were not admitted when they originally applied. Again, it may happen, but it should not be the primary reason. Plus, my hope for anyone taking a gap year will always be put the college admissions process behind you and don't even think about it. Plus, it's obviously much easier to apply, as probably all of you will anyway, during your senior year in high school and not have to deal with getting forms submitted and all the rest from wherever you may be for your gap year. If you end up reapplying somewhere or applying for the first time somewhere during your gap year, it is honestly very important to be honest with the college to which you've paid your deposit about the fact that you're doing that. They will have their own internal policies. You can find out in advance what they are, but do not play games with, getting in someplace because you could get yourself into trouble and be left high and dry, which happened to me when I was at Middlebury once.
And anecdotally, I had a friend that I met during my gap year who had waited to apply. And so we were in Nepal and they were going through the college application process. And in Nepal, we maybe had power for 2 or 3 hours a day. And so they were trying to submit their applications. They were getting answers back and, sometimes not getting in places. And that just made their experience a lot more miserable. While the rest of us were having, kind of a grand time doing our things. So they were a lot more stressed out and a lot more miserable because they had decided to wait and were applying during their experience.
I'm going to say something on the other side of this. So just for you parents and students, sometimes students apply and get into these schools and then they really change and they want to look at different kinds of institutions, and so you have that second option. I think all the reasons that were given are really good and valid. It's certainly easier to get in and defer and not have to think about it. And sometimes people really do want to look again, and they're willing to take the time to do that during the gap time, or they've had a chance to go visit some of these colleges that they maybe didn't get to visit. So they use part of their fall to do that. Thanks.
I agree, Holly. I mean, sometimes students really do reinvent themselves during their gap year, and that's a really good reason to switch gears on the college front.
Yeah, and not like you said, as in order to get into a better college, but genuinely, it's like, what suits me? Where do I want to go? And my daughter is a senior and went through this whole process. In the end, she said, I'm just beginning to figure out now, after having done all these applications, what might work for me or what might not. I'm thinking more about it, and it's done. So it's a real learning curve.
I believe part of the reason we believe our gap year students are better prepared, as Bob has shown, is they have another year to mature too, right? The brain develops fully, we make decisions better, we mature. And I can see that a gap year student being enlightened to different things, Holly. I can definitely see that. I think the counselor in me does want to share that we would recommend that the college search be in advance of the gap year because of a lot of the reasons Helen talked about, but students, our gap year students are usually planners. And while we will adapt to plans not working, right, Helen? But we want to know what's going to be there at the end. And but this is a perfect year as an example of that wasn't possible for some students. So it might be interesting to see what happens with our gap year cohorts this year if they didn't get to do really what we would say a healthy search.
Yeah.
So, and while we're on the topic of health, Holly, I'd love, all we're doing is talking about how great this is going to be, and this is a positive thing. Is there an unhealthy attitude or unhealthy way to go about, or unhealthy motivation for gap year programs?
Yeah, and before I answer that, I just want to say one more thing about if you think you're going to reapply to colleges, be kind to your high school counselors because they, give them a heads up. Can you circle back around and get their assistance again? So that's important for them to know.
Their teacher recommendations.
Right. I mean, one main thing, and this is very much at the core of why I love this work. For me, it's all about choosing. I'm choosing creating my life, and I'm taking ownership of my life. So if somebody tries to force a gap year on you, it's really belying that whole power of choosing. And so what I tell parents when they try and drag students into my office is, let's have the conversation and see where this goes. But you really, if your child says, I really want to go to college, then they should go to college. So that's one big one. One thing I find is that students often don't realize what they can do with this kind of a year, so they just need to be informed. And sometimes I'll have students say, hey, Holly, it sounds great. And they do their brainstorming session with me, and yet they say, I choose college this fall. What you know is that they've chosen. They're not just going to college because it's the next step, and that's key. And that's what Helen was talking about, I think, is just more of ownership. And the other thing is, we've already mentioned, is I just think it's a real pity to try and sort of look good to get into a better college when you had this incredible time in your life that, as you older adults know, it's harder to do this later, to really give yourself freedom to lead from the core, those core interests, because you're going to learn from everything. There's no perfect way of doing this. You don't have to be good at anything. It's all of these things are going to give you skills that are going to be helpful down the line. You don't know where some things might lead. One of my students came back to me and said 10 years later after his gap year, he's in the recording arts field. He said, Holly, I always keep the koala sanctuary that I did in Australia on my resume. Never relates to a job I'm trying to get, but it's an interesting talking point. It's like I come across as a more interesting human being. So everything is valid if it draws you. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Helen, I'd love to know, you're at Reed out in Portland. How many other gap year students do you run into? Is it a regular occurrence, or is it kind of an anomaly, do you feel, at least at a school like you're at?
It's definitely not an anomaly. During my orientation, in my orientation group, there was another student who had taken a gap year, actually, like within that group of 10 to 15 people. I will say now that once you kind of get out of orientation, we don't talk about it that much. Our conversations mostly revolve around, hey, can you help me with the chemistry homework nowadays? But the experiences do come up, and people are supporters of it. The big thing that happens at Reed, I think, is more the internal gap year. People tend to realize after their first or second year that, you know what, I really do need a break, and take it then. So I have a few of my friends who are currently doing that, where they're like, yeah, I need a break. I'm done. There are things I want to do. I need to figure out kind of who I am, what I want to major in. And the way to do that is to take some time off for them. So that is another thing that happens at Reed. I think our 4-year graduation rate is incredibly low because a lot of students take that time off.
Good to know. Thank you. Bob, I want to direct a question to you. So why don't more students do gap years?
That's a good question. A lot of us are trying hard to increase those numbers. I think the obvious answer, but I think it's also true, is that still, despite all these upsides that we've been talking about of taking a gap year, most students prefer to stay on the kind of conventional path. And they've been looking forward for many years to going to college and having the freedom that they will have there. And why would I do anything that would put that prospect a year farther away? And I think also for some students, and when one gets to be older, you know, that the difference in years becomes increasingly less important. But I think for a lot of students, you know, saying they don't want to be going to college with students who are a year younger than they are, probably is a factor, because they're already kind of looking down their noses probably at the stupid juniors in their high school when they're looking at gap years, and God forbid that they have to, you know, go to college with that group. But of course, everybody grows up, and ultimately that year makes zero difference in their lives and in their gap year experiences. So, I mean, obviously a big part of what those of us who are engaged in the field in some way are trying to do is to increase the numbers, because it is a win-win for everybody. It is a win for the students. It is a win for the parents, because they're going to be getting a lot more for their money. It is certainly a win for the institutions, the colleges and universities that they go to, because they end up with more mature and more focused students who will take advantage of the opportunities. So, but it's an uphill battle for a lot of students and families to get them to kind of see that there will be probably very few, if any, downsides to taking a year off.
I also just add that this is a really young field relatively in the United States. So really nobody was talking gap year in the 80s. And you know, I wouldn't call it mainstream now, but there's so much more awareness and support and all this research that, you know, people like Bob are doing, and higher ed paying attention. That's a huge shift that I've seen, because I've got to watch this field from its inception and when it was kind of in the full swing in the UK. So I think that's another reason there actually are quite a few people taking gap time compared to what we saw before. It's just a matter of educating. You know, the fact that Helen knew about this at 6 is great. You know, or the fact that parents have taken gap times themselves. When we first started interviewing families, it was a generation of people, parents in their 50s, white knuckled. What is this gap year? And it's going to derail my child. You know, they didn't have a sense of it. And then it began to shift over time. It's like, yep, I want to take a gap year. Usually the parents want to go.
Let me say a quick word in addition to that for those parents out there with younger students. This last year's cohort, for very obvious reasons, of gap year students is much, much larger. Based on a study that I did of, it was around 30 institutions that responded to a survey I sent out it was late summer, early fall. The average increase in the number of students requesting gap years was about threefold. And what that is, excuse me, providing the Gap Year Research Consortium to do is to do a much broader study of all of the impacts of taking a gap year. Academically, that we're doing a longitudinal study now on the impact on social and emotional and behavioral health in college. So stay tuned, because we're hoping to have some really rich data in the coming years about all kinds of other impacts of taking a gap year.
Thanks, guys. JT, that's a nice lead into the defer. We had a little conversation about how many students deferred admission last year. I know it means something different at Tufts, but what do you consider a gap year at Tufts, and what wouldn't you consider a gap year? And I know Tufts doesn't allow defers, but other schools might. So what would it take for Tufts to consider something an actual gap year? Or maybe say, no, we don't accept that as a gap year option. You need to look elsewhere, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a great question. So at some institutions, and Tufts is one of those institutions, for any student, so every student that we admit is admitted for the fall of that year. So the students that we just admitted this year are admitted for the fall of 21. For students who wanted to take a year off, even last year, they needed to have a productive plan. They had to have some sort of proposal about how they might spend the year. It couldn't just be, things might be virtual this fall, or I don't know what's happening, therefore I just want to take a year off and see how things go. What we asked all of the students who wanted to do a gap year at Tufts to do was to tell us what they were thinking about doing. and what value that would hold for them. And so what it basically asked students to do was really think about how they want to spend this year. Even at the time, it was very uncertain about what the year was going to look like. Give us a thought of what you're thinking about. And that helped, I think, some students get some clarity about what their interests are and what they might do with their time, and helped us understand that quite a bit. We were one of the colleges that had about a threefold increase in the number of students taking a gap year, but every single one of them came to us with a plan. And we know that some of those plans might be the course of the year, but it wasn't just, I'm going to stay home and watch videos, or I'm going to stay home and just like be at home for the year. They had to have some idea of what it is they were thinking about doing, and then update us in December about what their plans were. And those plans could have been some sort of virtual internship. It could have been a travel experience. It could have been a part-time job. It could have been exploring some hobby or some personal interest or personal passion. So students had different ideas of how they would spend the year. But we needed to know something about what they were thinking about doing. So there are lots of universities that will say, you can't just take a year off. It's really about coming to us with an idea of how you might spend that year.
Thanks, JT. We're gonna go to closing thoughts now, and I'm gonna change the order up a little bit since we had JT just speak, and he was gonna be first. So, Holly, you want to kick us off with kind of closing thoughts, things that maybe we didn't get to touch on that you think are important, or just some words of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's often people are asking about, if most parents are parents of juniors or younger, maybe it's not such a concern because COVID is subsiding. So just how this works in the face of COVID, what was remarkable that I saw last year, with our over 160 students, hardly any of them were doing anything online. They were doing all hands-on programs, either in the US or Ireland or Israel or Italy. Later South Africa, conservation projects. It was more limited, but people were still able to step into things. And one girl said to me, I don't care what I do, I just don't want to be home in front of a computer. I just want to be with people doing something hands-on. So I think expectations were lower as well. And what's the truth about gap year is that you learn from everything, as I said before. There's no perfect program. So just the process of stepping away from home and stepping into the world, not in a classroom, not in the familiar, is really powerful, no matter what you do. And also to just, for parents, is just to let your child grab the reins. I mean, I think that can be difficult because parents are concerned, but that's the process. You're giving that agency to your child. And what I've seen over the years of working with so many students is people choose well for themselves if they're given options. And then they step into it. And there's a lot of motivation because they're going towards something they're excited about. So there's a carrot out in front of them. And that drives a lot of the engine and the power and the success of gap time. And again, I said this before, I think, but for you older adults, just, sometimes parents are looking through the parent lens and not realizing, hey, what would I have done if I could have taken a year like this if I didn't get to? You know that it's harder later to do this. There's no rush. And this could be some of the most important time you take in your life in terms of pivoting you towards something you love or away from something you don't want to be doing. And all those skills, you don't get to do this later on. You're really on the track. And so anyway, so those are the main things I would say. Thank you again for inviting me to be part of this.
Terrific, Holly. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Bob, you want some closing thoughts, or maybe something that we've missed?
I think we've covered quite a lot, actually. I hope we still have an engaged audience. Every time I'm on a panel like this, I am reminded of being on a similar panel quite a few years ago in New York City. And there happened to be, to cite Tufts again, there happened to be a provost from Tufts University on that panel. I'm sure JT, even though you haven't been there very long, may know who I'm talking about. I'm blanking on his name. But he started his presentation with this line before he said anything else after his introduction. He said to this audience of, high achieving students and their parents, he said, everybody in the United States takes a gap year. And then he paused as the people were kind of looking quizzically at each other. And then he said, it's called freshman year. And sadly, I mean, it's funny on the one hand. Sadly, on the other hand, that is too often true, that for all the reasons I talked about in the beginning, that the pressure that we put on the admissions process and the importance culturally of getting into certain places leads to this feeling during, particularly on arrival and during freshman year, that, okay, I can finally relax and do what I want. And that is sad, because ultimately a lot of time and money gets wasted in the process. And people eventually grow up, of course, but it can lead to a wasted freshman year. So as you think about this process, and if you're on this call, you're probably at least open-minded to the possibility in this conference. I think the most important thing is to be very intentional about what you'd want to get out of a gap year. You know, be it a skill set or perhaps preparation for a career that you're already considering in the form of an internship or whatever it might be. Environmental awareness, getting involved in politics perhaps was quite popular before the election. Be intentional about what you want to get out of this experience, and then find opportunities that will help you achieve that goal. And this is just for you. It's not to impress anybody else. So do it very personally about what you would want to get out of it. And I think that's ultimately what is going to lead to your getting the most out of the experience.
Thank you, Bob. Helen, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah. Going into the gap year, my biggest fear was definitely well, what if I fall behind? What if I've forgotten everything I've learned and go in and can't do 2 + 2 anymore? Not quite that extreme, but you get the idea. The fact of the matter is, though, not all high school students learn the same thing. You learn different things depending on what high school you go to, what state you're from, all of that. And colleges are very aware of that fact. So when you get to college, a lot of freshman year is learning, you're reviewing how that college wants you to write. How, if you've taken chemistry before, they want you to restart. They want to teach you the basics again to make sure everybody's on the same page, because they know we've all come from different places and don't all haven't had all the same learning experience. So you don't need to worry about falling behind. The college and the classes are designed to make sure that everybody ends up on the same page by the end of them.
Thanks, Helen. JT, we're gonna wrap things up with you.
Yeah, there's 2 pieces of advice. Number 1, be like Helen. She's awesome. She took a gap year, so be like Helen. And number 2, a lot of what's been said tonight, society has a structure to think that you need to go to high school for 4 years, and then you need to go to college for 4 years, and then you need to do Here's an opportunity to hit reset. And here's an opportunity to figure out what you need to do as you wrap up your high school experience, and whether or not college is the right next thing for you to do. College will be there. And if you take a year or 2 off before you go there to focus on something else, I think that's a win. And I will say what's been said here before. Every single gap year student that I have met in my career has been among the most mature and the most prepared when they show up on a college campus. They know who they are. They have a better sense of who they are, and they're ready, and they're excited to be on a college campus. And I just think here's an opportunity for you to think about what it is that you need to do. And if you have a family that is supporting you and exploring a gap year, that's an even bigger win right there, because not everyone has a family that's supportive of that. So lean into that, explore, have the conversation, and figure out if that's what you want to do, and be like Helen.
You guys got me fired up. My daughter's going to be a freshman in college next year, and I'm already thinking about, can we do what like those Reed students do and take a gap year in the middle? I'm fully interested in exploring the option for her right now, being one of those supportive parents. JT, I want to thank a bunch of people, and then we'll send everybody on their way. But everyone who is participating tonight, please thank your college counselor for allowing us to advertise this, for helping us put this together. The college counselors in the Delaware independent schools are a phenomenal group, and we're always trying to find different ways to deliver you content, whether it's big items or kind of the gap year, I think falls under a niche topic right now. And I know everyone on the panel hopes it's not a niche topic in a few years or 10 years from now, or wherever it is that we're talking about it on a regular basis. But please thank your college counselor at your school for assisting us with this program. I would give you a big round. I think our audience would give you a big round of applause, everybody on our panel tonight. I want to thank everybody for volunteering their time. It is the beauty of Zoom and the pandemic that we've been forced to go virtual, but I guarantee you I wouldn't have these people in front of you right now if we had to do it in person. So thank you, all of our panelists, for joining us tonight. And we're going to we recorded this tonight, so it is going to serve us beyond just tonight. That I know when I talk to a student interested in a gap year, we're just going to send them the URL and say, come talk to me if you have questions further. But this group's just extremely generous with their time and their expertise. So everyone, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. And I think we're close enough to the holiday weekend to say, have a wonderful holiday weekend with family and friends. Be safe. Take care. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Take care.